After a one-day break from our scheduled series about the double legendary potential for all specs, we go back with the last batch of specs that we have missed, which is the ranged group. Just like all the other roles that we have already gone through, melee, tanks and healers, we're going to be looking at which of the specs look like they're going to have the better potential or the better choice and options and the better, possible strength to look forward when inevitably you will be able to equip to legendaries. Legendaries, of course, have very big power levels that can be granted to you. It's not like a best in slot trinket or having extra sockets in your gear. It can go all the way up to 10% of your damage, some legendaries even more. So when you can equip two of them at the same time, it can swing things heavily in favor or in detriment of certain specs. And of course, DPS are the more volatile of the roles that can change a lot based on legendaries. Tanks and healers can change quite a bit in power based on double legendary, but DPS, of course, can have the more drastic changes. When it comes to range DPS, there's going to be some sad moments for quite a lot of you when we go over and we list them in terms of powers, starting from the bottom, because there are going to be some powerful specs that are going to have the option and the possibility to use some very nice synergistic legendaries together. But on the bright side, there are also a couple of specs, 3 I think, that are not really played at all right now, with some pretty nice synergy in their legendaries. And before we start, let's remind everyone again that having two legendaries that don't synergize together or are poor is not gonna mean that the spec itself is poor. The spec could be doing just fine even with a weak legendary, because the spec is tuned to do quite well already, so not having good synergy on legendaries doesn't mean too much. At the bottom, when it comes to double legendary power and synergy, we have Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest doesn't have that many options. They have gotten recently, just a few days ago, a change in the priority of their legendaries due to some simulation mistakes, which overvalued or rather undervalued a secondary stat, Mastery. But even with this sorted, they pretty much can go just for Talbadar Stratagem and Eternal Call of the Void. So when you look at those two legendaries which are already performing fine in single target, you start looking if the other legendaries that are, forgotten have some sort of synergy with these two legendaries. Because maybe the legendary in and of itself is poor, but if you pair it with a current strong legendary, it's going to gain more value. The answer is no. There isn't really anything that is going to increase the value of a legendary simply because it's going to be matched with another one. Talbadar is going to essentially increase your funnel damage on your primary Mind Blast target, and Eternal Call of the Void is basically a corruption tendril. The addition here is that it's going to give you some insanity as well, but the synergy together is quite minor. So when you put them together, there isn't really much you can go for. The only slight possibility, which is still not going to be too much of a synergy, is going to be Shadow Flame Prism, which used to be a very, very powerful Mythic Plus legendary in the beta, which has gotten nerfed a few times already. Maybe when you'll be able to equip two legendaries at the same time, it's going to gain more value, but it doesn't look like it will, especially because there isn't really anything that is going to synergize with this legendary either for Shadow Priest. So the spec doesn't seem like it's going to have strong synergy in its legendaries. Shadow Priest, luckily for you, Shadow Priest players, is a spec that has notoriously good scaling in the late game. So it's not as crucial for you to have very good synergy in legendaries to keep you scaling in the end game, to keep you scaling in the expansion, because you're already scaled by yourself with your secondary stats, with your gear. So it's not as crucial. Another spec here without too much synergy is going to be Destruction Warlock. So Destruction Warlocks right now are basically going just for Cinders of the Ajakir. This is a very smooth legendary. The extra Conflagrate charge and the cooldown reduction, which is basically similar to the talent of Fire Mages, Flame On, to give them more Fire Blast charges and reduce cooldown. Of course, Conflagrate is not as crucial to the Destruction Warlock build as a Fire Mage, but it still has the effect of giving your rotation much more smoothness because you are playing with Backdraft, which gives you haste, cast speed whenever you use Conflagrates, so it makes the spec much smoother. When you pair it with other things, Destruction doesn't have too much of good synergy, particularly in single target. One of the legendaries that is going to be encompassing of all Warlock specs, so you will see this multiple times, is the Relic of Demonic Synergy, essentially a bouncing buff to your pet and yourself of just a flat damage increase. Now, flat damage increases are not very synergistic with anything, of course, especially when they are random. You don't proc them by casting a certain ability. It just randomly happens, so you can't even line it up whenever you want with your burst, for example. So it's never going to have that good of a synergy, a legendary like this one. And another one, which is also going to be decent, at least decent for all the Warlock specs, is going to be Wilfred's Sigil, because of the cooldown reduction on your main summon, Dark Lair, Tyrant, and Infernal. All these three are very powerful on their own, so that legendary can still have value, but when you start thinking about pairing it with your current most performing legendary, which is the Cinders, there isn't much that is going to synergize. There isn't much that, as I mentioned before, is going to make a 100 power legendary paired with another 100 power legendary equal 300 or 400 or 500, because they gain more power than they're worth on their own if they're put together. Destruction does have some pretty good scaling with haste, possibly later into the expansion, a bit later than just maybe a couple of months. They will be able to do maybe things like Madness of the Ajakir for the extra Chaos Ball damage. It's just that on just a 3-second long buff right now, they don't have the haste, they don't have the speed to keep this buff up. Maybe when you pair this legendary together with Cinders of the Ajakir, being able to use multiple conflagrates in a row for more backdraft procs and faster casts of Chaos Bolt, you will be able to keep up this legendary for longer and give it much more effectiveness, because right now this legendary is very poor, simply because you can't use it properly right now. So we will have to see later on in the expansion how well Destruction scales, if this legendary will be made much more viable, because of course it has a lot of power. You know, Chaos Bolt is a crucial part. I know you still have PTSD from BFA of how powerful Chaos Bolt was, so there is still the chance that eventually Destruction Warlock will scale later on into the expansion again. A nice possibility for Destruction, though, is something that was unhurted in the beta, which is when you play with Embers of Diabolic Raiment, which isn't really used right now, because on its own, it's just not enough. Incinerate now generates 100% additional fragments. When you put this together with Fire and Brimstone, the talent, makes you gain a gigantic amount of soul shards. Now, this is very powerful in and of its own, but it doesn't have the crowning jewel. It doesn't have the final touch. When you will be able to use two legendaries, you would be able to put the final touch on this combo, which is the already mentioned Wilfred's Sigil. Because now, in Mythic Plus, in AoE, you will be able to gain a massive amount of soul shards with an AoE Incinerate, which generates more than double the soul shards of a normal one. And then, the more soul shards you dump in Rain of Fire, the shorter the cooldown of your Infernal becomes. This was pretty powerful in the beta, and that was with just one legendary, without you being able to pair them together. So there is a possibility that this combo would make Destruction much more powerful in Mythic Plus. Now, the last of the sort of disappointing specs at the bottom is going to be Marksmanship Hunter. Well, I mentioned this already with Survival, that you will have seen this with Marksmanship and eventually Beast Mastery as well. Hunters are not too exciting when it comes to the legendaries. They have standout couple of legendaries and not much else. In the case of Marksmanship, of course, is the Serpent Stalker's Trickery. In single target, it does pretty much more damage than 4 other legendaries combined. For Marksmanship, that's the current state, so it's going to be a no-brainer that Serpent Stalker is going to stay as a powerful single target legendary. The effect of throwing Serpent Stings at the target with aim shot is also going to work on the AoE aim shot you can throw out with a ricochet, which is going to also make it very powerful in Mythic Plus, when paired together with your other AoE legendary, which is Secrets of the Unblinking Vigil. This is the main synergy of Hunter, of Marksmanship, that they have specifically just in AoE. Now, when you compare these two together, you're going to have more uptime on your aim shot usages. Because it's AoE, because it's Mythic Plus, you're going to be able to proc your trick shots very, very often, which is going to allow you more ricochet, more cleave damage more often. So it's just powerful in Mythic Plus. They don't have pretty much any other synergy in the legendaries. There is still the old and boring Soulforge Embers for AoE damage, but again, it has no synergy with pretty much anything else in your kit. And then when it comes to single target, there is nothing. When it comes to single target, there is nothing that is going to be usable with your main legendary, your Trickery. So it is pretty poor right now. So on the horizon for Marksmanship, it doesn't look like there's going to be a single target resurgence, and this is going to be pretty much a matter of taste. Sometimes people prefer becoming stronger in the point they are already strongest at. Other times people prefer shoring their weaknesses, improving their weakest link. In the case of Marksmanship, their strongest point is already AoE, and their weakest point is already pure single target. So this setup of legendaries is going to make your AoE even stronger, and your single target even weaker, when you compare to all the other specs that can get better advantages with their single target double legendary combo. So this is more about preference, whether or not you like becoming even stronger in AoE or not. Now we move on from these three specs, which have had the lowest amount of synergy, to the other Hunter spec. Just to get rid of all the Hunter specs, we have Beast Mastery. So sadly, very sadly, and also unsurprisingly, Beast Mastery has two legendaries they can use in both situations because, of course, the legendaries are so poor. Number one, repeated again, is going to be Soulforge Embers. Soulforge Embers remains very powerful in AoE for all Hunter specs. This is also particularly more powerful for Beast Mastery because, as you know, BM Hunter players, I'm sorry to remind this to you, Blizzard target capped your Beast Cleave, and as a Hunter, you don't really have any other AoE outside of your Beast Cleave, so Soulforge Embers is going to give you a lot of help in AoE, which is why it is such a powerful legendary for BM. And unfortunately, and this is not good, this doesn't look good, it is also your strongest single target legendary. This is a bomb that explodes in AoE. If your spec has this legendary as your single target best one, it is not a good look for your spec. The other couple of legendaries that are pretty usable are the Lilac Stalkers, Piercing Fangs, which is just extra critical damage dealt during your Bestial Wrath, as well as Dire Command, giving you a 20% chance to summon a Dire Beast when you use Kill Command. So, number one, Lilac Stalker is actually good in scaling, so later in the expansion is going to become more and more valuable because this is a legendary that is going to affect your crit chance, which means the more crit chance you have, the more this legendary is going to gain effectiveness because it is based off of crit damage. Number one. Number two, when you equip two legendaries, Beast Mastery is in this curious situation where Dark Command, as you see, is based on Kill Command, right? That's a 20% chance when you use Kill Command. Then you have Flamewaker's Cobra Sting, which gives you a 25% chance to make your next Kill Command consume no focus. And then you have Kapla, which makes your Barb Shot reduce the cooldown of Kill Command by 5 seconds. These are three different legendaries that all synergize with Kill Command. So ideally, they look very good together. They have very good synergy. Maybe later into the expansion in a year or something, when you can use three legendaries, this is going to be great for Beast Mastery. Maybe in a year from now, Beast Mastery will be flavor of the month because they can use these three together. Unfortunately, right now, these three legendaries are doing significantly less DPS than the rest. Just Dire Command is doing pretty well. Maybe because of Dire Command, if you pair it with one of the other two Kill Command focused legendaries, is going to gain much more value. That's the only bright possibility for BM Hunter. Otherwise, similar to the other Hunter specs, they are stuck with just a couple of viable ones and then Soulforge Embers as a backup, which isn't too exciting. Now, first of the mages, we go for Arcane. When we look at Arcane, purely based on their current performance, Temporal Warp and Siphon Storm are the strongest single target legendaries they can pick. Of course, Temporal Warp is basically just a double Bloodlust for you, and then Siphon Storm, I'm sorry to everyone who also has PTSD from this, is essentially just Ajara's Font of Power in form of a legendary. Using Evocation is basically going to turn you into an intellect, a pretty big intellect buff. We know our Arcane is powerful and dependent on its burst window, so you have a second Bloodlust to give you an even stronger burst window, and then you have a Siphon Storm to use your Evocation as an empowerment for your burst window. So these two can go together with some good synergy, essentially, but it's not great. It's not even obvious at first glance. They can be matched together, but it doesn't look too massive. The other thing for Arcane is that they do have a very powerful AoE legendary, which is Arcane Bombardment. Now, Arcane Bombardment, if it is very strong in AoE, you start looking at possible synergies for Arcane Bombardment. Is there anything that is going to give you maybe free Arcane charges so you can spam more Arcane Barrages? Is there anything that can give you Arcane Barrage damage increase so this legendary becomes even stronger? The main pick in the Arcane Arsenal to pair with this in AoE is going to be Arcane Harmony. Arcane Harmony is basically the only pick you can go for with Arcane Bombardment if you want to feed it more power in terms of damage increase. It is a possibly very powerful combo in Mythic Plus. There is then the question of whether or not you would even want to use when you have access to double legendary, or even right now, Arcane Missile when you're hitting 5, 6, or 7 targets as Arcane Mage. Maybe Arcane Echo for the extra splash damage on Touch of the Magi with a lot of Arcane Missile hits is not even going to be worth compared to Reverberate to buff your Arcane Explosion. So you would find yourself with a double legendary combo, which can be very powerful to buff your Arcane Barrage, but in that moment you just want to spam Arcane Explosion. rather than Arcane Missiles. So that would be kind of weird. We'll have to see just how powerful the combo is going to be, if it makes it even worth. If it doesn't make it worth, and Arcane Explosion into Arcane Barrage is just better than this combo, then, you know, the possible potential in AoE becomes a little bit lower for Arcane when it comes to synergy with your legendaries. And then the last spec I will be looking at here, which is the middle of the pack, is going to be Affliction Warlock. Affliction Warlock is here because, well, it's pretty boring. It doesn't really have many options. As a spec, it's doing quite fine right now, quite well, but when you look at its legendaries, there isn't really much. You know, Relic of Demonic Synergy, I believe, is pretty boring. It is not very fun to play with. It doesn't really give you much of anything. It does allow a spec like Affliction, which is probably better than a spec like Demonology and Destruction, to basically sit on your soul shards, sit on your capped soul shards for your Malefic Rapture, wait for the buff of Relic of Demonic Synergy on yourself, and then dump your soul shards with Malefic Rapture, so it's pretty good. There aren't really any synergies that can increase the effectiveness of your Malefic Rapture dump window. There is pretty much nothing that allows you to do this, so you have to go for basically the second best. When you have no synergy to pair together, you just look at which other legendary has more effectiveness, and in the case of Affliction, is going to be Perpetual Agony of the Ajakir. Pretty simple. More targets, more agonies, more soul shards, more Malefic Raptures. That's basically just it. It doesn't have, as mentioned, too much synergy with Relic of Demonic Synergy legendary, because that legendary wants you to pull your soul shards, to wait until you can just spam them all when you get your buff. And this other legendary, Perpetual Agony, is going to give you more soul shards. So it's not going to have extremely good synergy with that legendary. Is, you know, with the way their current strongest legendary works for Affliction, Affliction would have wanted a legendary doing something like casting Malefic Rapture gives you 5% more damage on your Malefic Rapture for 5 seconds, stacking up like 10 times, which would have incentivized the pulling and the spamming in a row of Malefic Rapture. Unfortunately, Affliction doesn't have a legendary like that, so they will have to settle for this combo, which is still powerful. Again, this is one of the cases where it's more about the spec currently being powerful, giving you the impression that their legendaries are also going to be effective, mostly because you just look at what they're doing right now and you're like, oh yeah, sure, these legendaries are going to make them even stronger. But in terms of synergy, in terms of the power they are gaining from their legendaries, it isn't too impressive. Now we are in the top 5. This is where we will start seeing some more distinctive synergies, some more powerful synergies when put together, and we're starting with the last of the Warlocks. We are starting with Demonology. So with Demonology, we have already a very powerful AoE combo. This is very good because Demonology already has 2 legendaries on their own, very powerful in AoE. They have very high damage, even more than most other specs already. And what makes it interesting, what makes it promising, you can say, for Demonology, is that these 2 legendaries are also the most synergistic within themselves, because they are Forces of the Horned Nightmare and Implosive Potential. For people who don't know about Demonology, so 99.74% of people watching this, Hand of Gul'dan is what spawns imps. So double casting Hand of Gul'dan is going to double summon imps. So the synergy is already self-revealing from this. You're going to gain much more haste, much more reliably, thanks to these 2 legendaries coupled together. Maybe even to make it worth in single target, since, as you can see, the heavy effectiveness of Implosive Potential is when you're hitting multiple targets for AoE. But it could be so powerful to be even worth in single target, although that's unlikely. When we look at single target, we do have another possible combo, which is going to be with Grim Inquisitor's Dread Calling. So I'm going to leave this to the Demonology Warlock experts, because what usually happens in these situations is that when you get certain abilities that you can cast for free, they're still going to count as if you spent resources for them. You just don't actually spend them. For example, a Paladin can get a free spender on Divine Purpose, and then Divine Purpose can proc again off of the free spender you use with Divine Purpose, even though technically you didn't actually spend any resource, because Divine Purpose made it free. You used to be able to proc them 2 in a row, or if you won the lottery, even 3 in a row, even if technically they were all free. This could be a similar situation. When you use Hand of Gul'dan with Forces of the Horned Nightmare, and you proc the free Hand of Gul'dan, it might still stack up the damage of Grim Inquisitor's Dread Calling, which is going to make it very good for single target. So if it does work like this, this would put Demonology in a situation to have 2 very good synergies for both AoE or single target to choose from. which is why I would say it's higher rated than the other two Warlock specs. There is clear synergy here for Demonology. The other spec I would put next to Demonology, right before the best three, is going to be Frost Mage. So what does Frost Mage have more than Arcane, which I put lower? Well, first of all, Frost has two very distinct and powerful legendaries for both AoE and single target. The AoE is Glacial Fragments, and the single target is Sleek Ice. They were both buffed, particularly Glacial Fragments. If you have followed the beta, meaning if you have followed me, you will know that Frost Mage used to be insane. Freezing Winds, their old legendary version around Frozen Orb, was insane. After it got giga nerfed, Blizzard buffed Glacial Fragments in return, and it made it an extremely powerful AoE legendary around Ice Lances and Ice Lance explosions of damage. Flick Ice was also buffed, and it made it very good for single target. So this is very powerful. This means you can pick your single target fight or your AoE fight, start with your legendary, your main legendary, and then start looking down the list of which legendaries can synergize with each one. You're not bound, you're not locked in place by a single legendary because it's just so strong, so much stronger than anything else that you always have to use this one. In Frost case, you have two very distinct ones, and luckily for Frost, you can find good synergy for both AoE or single target. So I mentioned this before, if you are not used to Frost, Frost is one of the more proc heavy, RNG heavy, slot machine heavy specs right now because they live or die. They are literally on life support, and what gives them air to breathe is their procs, their Brain Freeze and their Fingers of Frost. Without them, they are basically just a water elemental throwing frostbolts and nothing else. They are terrible. So anything that can enhance their procs is going to get massive value. In this case, Expanded Potential is going to be very powerful to pair together with Slick Ice, because Slick Ice, of course, empowers your frostbolts, and Expanded Potential is going to proc based on your frostbolt casts. Similarly, in AoE, you have Glacial Fragments, which is going to do damage based on your Ice Lance usages, which can be paired together with Freezing Winds, because Freezing Winds is now going to work based on Frozen Orb, and Frozen Orb is, of course, a very powerful AoE tool. It is powerful, of course, in single target as well, but specifically speaking, is very powerful in AoE. And Freezing Winds is going to give you Fingers of Frost, so more Ice Lance damage. You are already using an Ice Lance empowering legendary, like Glacial Fragments, so Freezing Winds is going to go very well with Glacial Fragments. So Frost finds itself in a situation where, somewhat unknowingly, because it means you will have to manage 4 different legendaries, but still it finds itself in a situation where they have 2 very clear, powerful synergies, one for AoE and one for single target, which is very nice. Frost is already a spec that can scale later into the game pretty nicely. Recently, in recent years, we have seen Fire Mage take that crown, because Fire Mage also happens to be a spec that scales very well. So we don't know exactly how it is going to scale. It is much more likely, based on what we will see Fire Mage and their synergies with legendaries, that the dominant spec is going to be given by Blizzard's balancing, more so than the legendaries at their disposal. So this leaves us with the last 3 specs, the specs that I think have more synergy at their disposal. We start with the lower of the 3, I believe, which is going to be Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shaman is in a very similar situation of Frost, because just like Frost, they have 2 very clear and distinct legendaries that are very powerful in either single target or AoE. It is actually even better or worse, depending on how you're seeing this, because Elemental has Wind Speaker's Lava Resurgence for single target and Echoes of Great Sundering for AoE. Now, unlike Frost, the synergy of Elemental is a little bit more lopsided, so it is more going to be about their single target than their AoE. But they still have the option for some good synergy for AoE. Just not as good as Frost Mage. Is going to be more about their single target. For their AoE, the main thing they can get to pair together with Echoes of Great Sundering is going to be Elemental Equilibrium. Elemental Equilibrium literally is going to become in AoE a legendary that changes your Frost Shock ability. Your Frost Shock in AoE is literally going to turn into a 30-second cooldown that increases your damage by 15% for 10 seconds. Because that's what you will use Frost Shock for. Use it every 30 seconds to proc this legendary. This is damage on demand. Damage increase on demand is something Elemental doesn't have, hasn't had for a long time. One of the biggest issues of Elemental is and has been the fact that they lack burst, that they lack damage increase, and this is particularly very powerful for Mythic Plus, for packs, for AoE, because it's going to be up every single pull. You can start the pull, you can pull your Maelstrom, you can use your Stormkeeper, start prepping your big AoE burst with your Storm Elemental and your Echoes of Great Sundering empowered Earthquakes, and then click Frost Shock, gain 15% more damage, and just increase your burst. So this is going to be pretty powerful in Mythic Plus as an extra damage increase, but it's not the main thing. It is powerful, not extremely synergistic. The synergy part is more about their single target. The real synergy is going to be around deeply rooted elements. This is the real part with your main legendary. Casting Lava Burst has a 7% chance to activate Ascendance for 6 seconds. And Ascendance is, for the non-elemental players, is going to give you infinite charges of Lava Burst and increase the damage of your Lava Burst based on your crit chance. You know, the higher end of Shaman logs with Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence on pure single target fights like Hungering Destroyer or even Zymox are casting Lava Burst every 3.2, 3.5 seconds. So this would mean proccing Ascendance every 50 seconds or so. And the more we go deeper into the expansion with the more haste, with the faster GCDs and the faster casting, this is going to become shorter and shorter. And this is also particularly good for Elemental because Elemental historically hasn't had very good scaling. Elemental historically had very poor usage out of their mastery. Elemental historically didn't do too well with haste either. Windspeaker's Lava Resurgence not only is a very powerful legendary, but it is giving a lot more value to Elemental for their haste scaling, which is very good. And coupling it with deeply rooted elements is even going to give more value to haste. It is going to keep critical strike chance a little bit more relevant. Since Lava Burst is a guaranteed crit, you lose a lot of value to your crit. DRE is going to give you a little bit more. So not just because of their legendary combo, but also because it's going to keep them more relevant in terms of scaling, in terms of secondary stats. It has an even better synergy than just the damage increase you will get from these couple of legendaries put together. But now we have the top two. Now, unfortunately, if you have kept track, these are not two specs that you wanted to see having a lot of synergy with the legendaries, so it is how it is, unfortunately. We are starting with Fire Mage. When you look at Fire Mage, I mentioned to other specs that it is going to be very good for you to have two different, very clear legendaries for either single target on AoE, because then it means you can fine-tune your second legendary to your specific single target one, and then another one to your specific AoE one. For Fire Mage, though, it's not like this. It's an exception. Why? Because Fire Mage is going to be very powerful in a single window, which is Combustion. And that is going to be for both AoE or single target, which means what you do want is a set of legendaries that is going to empower that window, Combustion, because there is no other alternative for a Fire Mage to play around with. It's just Combustion. So their current legendary is Feathered Incantation, which is going to remain their main legendary. It is simply self-explanatory. It gives you more crit damage based on your crit, and inside Combustion you always crit, so it's pretty obvious. The main obvious synergy which is going to be worth for both AoE or single target is going to be Disciplinary Command. Disciplinary Command is very similar, since we just went through Elemental, is very similar to Elemental Equilibrium. You are basically going to turn a couple of your Frost and Arcane spells into a cooldown that is going to increase your critical strike damage by 15%. This is very powerful because, again, Combustion guarantees you critting. So before you enter Combustion, you can proc Disciplinary Command, and on top of the 15% critical strike damage you get from Feathered Incantation, you're getting 15% more from Disciplinary Command. And that's literally all you want. Crit damage inside Combustion. And this is going to be used in single target, in AoE, burst, no burst, 2 targets, 3 targets, doesn't matter. It's going to be used for everything. That is why it is so powerful. One of the other possible options, which is losing a little bit more, value, it seems like, is going to be Firestorm. Firestorm is going to give you basically 4 seconds of Combustion, essentially. It is going to be more powerful in Mythic Plus than it is in single target bosses and fights in raids. However, it does look like the current combo of Feathered Incantation and Disciplinary Command is just so powerful for your Combustion that it doesn't look like it's going to be beaten. It is just very, very encompassing of all the damage profiles you want to have in whatever PvE activity you want to do. It's just too good because it focuses around your absolute strongest point, which is Combustion. Now you're going to be hearing a very similar talk about the other spec that is here, which is Balance. So Balance Druid is in a similar situation. Why? Because much like Fire Mage, but not as extreme, they do have a single legendary, all-purpose, which is Balance of All Things. Because like Fire Mage, they have only one thing in mind, which is doing as much damage as possible inside Eclipse. Of course, Eclipse is happening a little bit more often than Combustion, we can say, but Balance of All Things as a legendary makes its importance much shorter. The very first few seconds of your Eclipse, because of your crit chance increase in your first few GCDs. So you're like, okay, how can I benefit from this? How can I pair another legendary to make this current legendary even stronger? There are a couple of legendaries that can be pretty powerful in both situations. You can look at On It Clear's Vision. In Mythic Plus, this is going to give you the possibility as you're tunneling your main target in single target to get a bunch of free starfalls every now and again, which is always going to be useful in Mythic Plus, of course much less in raids. The other one is Time-Worn Dreambinder, simply because it's going to increase the damage of your Star Surge, which is what you want, as well as reduce its cost, which is going to allow you to dump more Star Surges in a row, which is also pretty powerful and synergistic with your Balance of All Things. But the real synergy, the real strong point, is Primordial Arcanic Pulsar. A return of this effect. In Shadowlands we have 12 seconds of Celestial Alignment every 300 Astral Power spent. The reason why this is so powerful isn't just because Celestial Alignment is good, which it is, of course. The reason why it is good, and this is probably the first time we actually mention this, is Covenant ability. We haven't talked about this yet, but we do have a legendary which is going to heavily increase the effectiveness of your Covenant ability, because this is going to be very powerful with Convoke the Spirits. Why? Because Celestial Alignment has a 3-minute cooldown and Convoke the Spirits has a 2-minute cooldown. This means, as a balanced druid, you have to often lose 1 or even 2 usages of Convoke the Spirits because you have to wait for Celestial Alignment every time, because of the massive damage increase of Convoke the Spirits if you are inside Celestial Alignment. So you never want to use it without, unless of course you don't have more time on the encounter to wait for Celestial Alignment, so you might as well use a Convoke. Normally it is a DPS loss because you have to line them up together. What this legendary is going to allow you to do is match together Convoke the Spirit with Celestial Alignment every single time. You won't ever lose usages of Convoke the Spirits. You will have a much higher usage time of Celestial Alignment because this legendary on its own is good already. It's going to give you some 48, 60, 72 seconds of Celestial Alignment during a fight, which is very powerful on its own. The reason why it becomes even more powerful is the added damage of Convoke that you wouldn't have gotten before. So this might not be as powerful in Mythic Plus, because of course in Mythic Plus timings are not as tight as a raid boss. You know, sometimes you have shitty pulls, you don't want to use your cooldowns, sometimes you have to move from pack to pack, or you are doing a boss and the boss is dying, there is no point in using your cooldowns, so it's not as important. In Mythic Plus you can go for some of the legendaries we have talked about before, like Circle of Life and Death, of course, dots in Mythic Plus, very good effectiveness, but just the sheer value that PAP, Primordial Arcanic Pulsar, is going to give you in unlocking your Convoke the Spirits. You have all been triggered by how effective Convoke the Spirits is, and this legendary is going to make it even stronger. So that is why balance is here. Which means, unfortunately, at the end of the day, the better performing specs right now are going to be looking promising when you look at double legendary, fire and balance. Even to a degree, Elemental Shaman. Meanwhile, specs that weren't doing that well, like Destruction, don't really seem to have much of anything promising coming up. We do have the dichotomy of Marksmanship Hunter. It could be seen as a disaster if you wanted to get better in single target, or it could be seen as super good if you only cared about AoE. What I am more interested in, looking in the future, is going to be Demonology and Frost. I think they do have some pretty good potential to become stronger and stronger, so we will have to see exactly how it goes. Just like in the other double legendary videos, please go ahead and point out a possible Ghetto combination that has gone missing that you think is going to be very powerful, very promising. And with this, we can now close this video. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I am choosing the next class to overview.